The moment I stepped into the Whitmore estate, I felt it. That cold, heavy silence money buys when it's trying to intimidate. The house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum built to remind you that you didn't belong there. Every surface gleamed like it had never been touched, the chandeliers above us casting sharp reflections off the marble floor. I had been invited to what they called a casual pre-wedding dinner, but nothing about that room felt casual. It felt like a trap set in silk and stone. Ethan sat next to me at that endless black dining table, his posture stiff, eyes darting like he already knew what was coming. His parents sat at the opposite end, Margaret and Charles Whitmore, the high priests of this private altar. She wore winter white, perfectly tailored, her hair swept back in a style that didn't move. Her smile, icy, precise, never reached her eyes. Charles barely acknowledged me, just a tight nod before resuming whatever power play he was running behind those eyes. Dinner was polite, too polite, the kind that tastes like warning. Small talk about the wedding, the weather in Boston, property markets. I kept my answers short, steady. I knew how to survive rooms like this. I'd built my life in rooms where men tried to make me feel small. I didn't expect this to be different. But what I didn't see coming was how brutal it would feel when the betrayal came not from them, but from the man sitting right beside me. It happened just as dessert was cleared. Margaret leaned slightly forward, her manicured fingers resting on a leather folder she had placed beside her wine glass. "Claire, dear," she said softly, "before we get too swept up in florals and guest lists, we thought it would be wise to finalize a few formalities." Her tone was pure silk, but the moment she slid the folder across the polished marble, dead center in front of my plate, the room went still. The sound it made, that soft thunk, was louder than any shout. My spine stiffened. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Ethan's hand found mine under the table. It was damp, shaking. He gave it a small squeeze, a signal, not of comfort, but of quiet. "Please, don't react. Don't make a scene. Just a simple agreement," Margaret continued. "A prenup, standard procedure for a family like ours. I'm sure you understand. We simply want to ensure that Whitmore Capital remains protected." Protected? From me? I finally placed my hand on the folder. The leather was smooth, expensive, rehearsed. I opened it slowly, pretending to read like I didn't already know what I would find. No shared assets, no claims on anything Ethan owned before or during the marriage, no rights to support, even in the event of infidelity. A confidentiality clause so tight it would gag me for life. It wasn't a prenup, it was an erasure. I closed the folder gently. "What exactly?" I asked quietly. "Do you think I'm here for?" Margaret's smile didn't waver. "We have to protect the legacy, Claire. This isn't personal." But it was. It was entirely personal, because the woman she saw across the table, me, she didn't see as family. She saw a threat, a risk, a gold digger with nice shoes and no pedigree. My voice didn't shake when I said, "Interesting timing to bring this up now, after the ring, after the engagement party, after I've moved into the apartment." Ethan finally spoke, a whisper only I could hear. "Please, just say you'll think about it. We'll talk later. I didn't know they were doing it like this." "Like this?" I turned to him, slow and deliberate. "You knew they were going to humiliate me. You just didn't expect to be in the room when it happened." He said nothing. The silence sat like fog between us. I stood up quietly. My chair scraped against the floor, the only sound in that cavernous room. I left the folder on the table, untouched now. I didn't look at Margaret or Charles. I didn't even look at Ethan. I said evenly, "I need time to think," and I walked out of the Whitmore estate without my coat into the freezing Boston night, the air sharp with lake wind and rage. Behind me, a marble dining room full of power and silence. In front of me, the weight of a question I could no longer ignore. Who was I marrying? Not a man, but a legacy. And maybe, just maybe, a leash. The wind off the bay stung my face as I walked to my car, still parked in the long stone driveway of the Whitmore estate. I wasn't shaking from the cold. I was shaking from clarity, not because they handed me a prenup, but because he let them. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, trying to breathe through the tremor that had taken hold of my chest. The betrayal didn't come from Margaret's cold smile or Charles' silent disapproval. It came from Ethan's hand, his damp, desperate hand, squeezing mine under the table, begging me not to speak, not to fight, not to ruin the illusion. It was in that silence, that squeeze, that I finally saw him for who he was. He wasn't just a man caught between love and legacy. He was a man who had never chosen anything for himself. Not really. I drove home in a fog, the rain beginning to tap against the windshield like a slow drumbeat of some private funeral. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt like someone else entirely. Or rather, like someone I used to be. I poured a glass of wine I didn't drink, sat in the dark, and stared at the wall. They thought I was Claire Morgan, product strategist at Eon Tech. Modest job, modest income, no pedigree. The woman Ethan had brought home like a charming little wild card. Palatable, polished, low risk. But what they didn't know was that Claire Morgan was a name I built after I walked away from the war. At 29, I sold my AI logistics startup, Novagrid, to a New York equity firm for just under $120 million. I signed NDAs strong enough to bury my name 3 times over. I didn't want the press. I didn't want a TED Talk. I wanted out. I was tired of being the only woman in the room and still having to prove I belonged. Tired of male investors asking if I had a more technical male co-founder. Tired of men flirting with my pitch deck more than my product. I built Novagrid in a windowless co-working space on ramen and 4 hours of sleep. I coded myself to the edge of burnout, then sold quietly and disappeared. With the help of my attorney and best friend, Rachel Adams, we built a network of holding companies, shell trusts, and clean paper trails. I became legally invisible. I paid off my student loans, bought this apartment in full, set up a trust for my grandmother so she'd never worry about medication or heating again. And then I started over. I took a real job at a mid-sized tech firm in Boston, woke up at 7, drank average coffee, filed tax returns like any other middle-class professional. I wanted peace. I wanted to remember who I was when no one was looking. Then Ethan walked into my life. We met at a tech ethics panel, of all places. He wasn't speaking, neither was I. We sat next to each other, both hiding from something. I was hiding from my past. He was hiding from a future that had already been written for him. Afterward, he asked me what I thought of the discussion. I told him it was 90% fluff and 10% genuine thought. And he laughed. Not the performative kind, but the kind that slips out when someone finally hears truth. We spent the next 2 hours drinking cheap beer on a waterfront bench, talking about real things. Loneliness, pressure, fear of failure. I told him a version of my story. Not the full truth, just enough. He told me about growing up in the Whitmore dynasty, about Margaret's velvet pressure, about Charles's indifference disguised as authority, how he felt like his life was a loan he had to repay in quiet obedience. He seemed exhausted, sad, soft in a way that men in his world weren't allowed to be. And I, who had built my life alone, fell for him because I thought I recognized that sadness, that ache for something real. I thought I could help him build a spine. But what I didn't see then, what I finally saw tonight, was that he didn't want one. Because the more time I spent inside his world, the more I noticed the cracks I tried too hard to ignore. His luxury condo, registered under Whitmore Trust Holdings LLC. His car, leased by the family foundation. His sleek black Amex, tied to a corporate family account. Even the ring he proposed with, a flawless emerald-cut diamond that once took my breath away, was insured under Margaret Whitmore's name. I found the policy by accident. One line in a file he left open on the kitchen counter. I asked him gently, "Why is your mom listed as the owner?" He didn't flinch. "Oh, it's just how we insure family jewelry. Keeps the taxes clean, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, because nothing was his. Not the apartment, not the car, not the credit, not the promises, not even the decisions. And when I finally dug deep enough, I realized something even worse. It wasn't that Ethan was trapped. It was that he had accepted the leash long ago and learned to call it comfort. That prenup wasn't the first blow. It was just the first time I realized the man beside me, the man I loved, had never once planned to stand on his own. And now, he was asking me to walk into the same cage. Quietly, politely, I finished my wine. My hands were still. My heart wasn't broken. It was sharpening. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was awake. The morning after the dinner, I called Rachel. I didn't need comfort. I didn't need someone to tell me I was right. I needed a strategy, and Rachel Adams was the sharpest weapon I had ever carried. When she picked up, her voice was all business. "You ready to stop bleeding and start drawing lines?" she said. "I want a prenup," I said calmly, "but this time, it's going to be on my terms." An hour later, we were seated in a glass-walled conference room at her firm's Boston office. Rachel wore black, like she was going to court, or war. Her legal pad was already half filled with notes by the time I finished walking her through what had happened. She didn't flinch at the word Whitmore. She didn't ask why I'd stayed with Ethan so long. She just leaned back, arms crossed, and said, "They're not looking for a daughter-in-law. They're looking for a controlled asset with good optics." "So let's give them a prenup," I replied. "But let's turn it into a mirror. Let's reflect every clause they wrote back at them." Rachel's eyes gleamed. "Now you're talking like a founder." We spent the next 4 hours crafting what she called a fortress in disguise. Every clause they tried to bury me with, Rachel reversed it. They said no access to Ethan's wealth? Fine. No access to mine either. No spousal support under any condition? Great. That goes both ways. Confidentiality about the marriage? Done. But all communications about the prenup are now considered legal record and admissible in court. The best part? We added a clause stating that no third-party entity, foundation, trust, or company owned by either family could interfere in the marriage, finances, or career decisions of the other partner. If Margaret ever tried her insurance trick again, or Charles tried to pull strings through Ethan's job, they'd be in breach of contract. It wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. By the time Rachel printed the document, bound in simple, neutral gray cardstock, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I walked out of Nova Grid's boardroom with a $100 million offer and my soul still intact. I felt calm. I emailed the agreement to Margaret Whitmore at 2:12 p.m. Subject line, proposal for review. Just one sentence in the body. If fairness is truly your priority, I've brought it to the table. She didn't respond, but Ethan did. 3 hours later, he showed up at my apartment without knocking. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked like someone who had been yelled at, hard. "What did you do?" he demanded the second I opened the door. "You emailed my mother a contract?" "I emailed a response," I said evenly, "to her contract." He followed me inside, pacing, anxious. "Claire, you don't understand how this looks. You're escalating. You're pushing her into a corner." "No," I said. "She pushed me first. I'm just not letting her close the door behind me." He looked at me like I'd spoken another language. "I'm trying to keep the peace," he said, voice trembling. "This isn't how it's done in my family." "I know," I replied, "because in your family, peace means silence, and love means compliance." "Claire, please," he said. "Can't we talk about this, without lawyers?" "No," I said sharply, "because you weren't the one expected to sign away your identity at dinner. You weren't the one who got evaluated like a financial risk." He sank onto my couch, hands buried in his hair. "I just want them to accept you." "They never will," I said. "And deep down, you know that. You're not asking them to accept me. You're asking me to make myself acceptable to them." Silence. Then I asked the question. The one I'd been avoiding because I already knew the answer. "If your parents refuse to sign this mirrored prenup, will you?" He looked up, eyes wide with panic. "Claire, don't make me choose." "I'm not," I said quietly. "I'm asking you to finally choose something." He stared at me, frozen, silent. And that silence said everything. Not just about him, but about us. I returned to the Whitmore estate 3 days later, not as a fiancé, not as a guest, but as someone walking into a final negotiation, with nothing left to lose. The house looked the same as before, immaculate, untouched, the kind of place where nothing ever breaks because nothing is ever real. As I stepped inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. How quiet it was. Not peaceful. Controlled. Like a courtroom before a verdict. Margaret was waiting for me in the dining room, seated exactly where she had been that night. Charles stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the garden as if I weren't there. Ethan sat between them, rigid, pale, already defeated. Margaret didn't offer me a seat. "I assume you're here to explain yourself," she said coolly. "Your counter-proposal was unnecessary." I smiled, just slightly. "I'm here to finish the conversation you started." She gestured to the chair across from Ethan, a queen granting permission. I sat slowly, placing my bag on the table with deliberate care. "You misunderstand something," she continued. "You don't have leverage here. My son does. This family does." I met her gaze, calm, steady. "That's interesting," I said, "because you sound very confident for someone who hasn't heard what I brought with me." Charles turned. Ethan shifted. Margaret's eyes narrowed. If this is another attempt to provoke. I reached into my bag and placed my phone on the table, screen down. "It's not a provocation," I said. "It's clarity." I tapped the screen once. The room filled with Margaret's own voice, cool, unmistakable. "Love doesn't protect an empire," the recording said. "Only obedience does. If Ethan wants to keep his position, he'll do as he's told." Silence slammed into the room. Charles froze mid-step. Ethan's head snapped up, his face draining of color. Margaret didn't move, but the air around her shifted. For the first time since I met her, she had no words ready. "That call," I said quietly, "was between you and your son, recorded legally. I didn't edit it. I didn't dramatize it. I simply listened." Ethan stared at his mother. "You said that was private," Margaret finally spoke. "You had no right." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You had no right to reduce your son's marriage to a compliance test, and you had no right to assume I would accept humiliation as a condition for love." I turned to Ethan then. "This is the moment. Right now." His hands trembled on the table. "If you believe in us," I said, "you'll sign the mirrored prenup. Today. Without revisions. Without your parents' approval." Margaret laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "You're asking him to destroy everything he's built." I shook my head. "No, I'm asking him to build something that's actually his." The room held its breath. Ethan looked at me, then at his mother, then at the floor. "I can't," he whispered. The words were small, almost apologetic. "I can't fight them," he said. "I'm not like you." And there it was. The truth I'd been circling for months finally stood still. He wasn't confused. He wasn't torn. He was decided. I nodded once, slowly, not in anger, in understanding. "Then this ends here," I said. Margaret straightened, already regaining control. "You're making a mistake." "No," I replied, standing. "I just stopped making one." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't ask him to follow me. I picked up my bag, glanced at the room one last time, the marble, the power, the silence, and realized something simple and devastating. This house had never been built for love, only for control. As I walked out, I didn't feel broken. I felt light, because I wasn't leaving behind a future. I was walking away from a cage. I never sent the recording to the press, but someone did. A week after I walked out of the Whitmore estate for the last time, the clip began circulating, first anonymously on a startup industry forum, then across financial media, then on primetime television. Margaret Whitmore's voice echoed across the internet. "Love doesn't protect an empire. Only obedience does." That sentence, 7 words, cracked open everything they had tried to keep sealed. Within 48 hours, shareholders of Whitmore Capital demanded an emergency board meeting. Within a week, 2 investigative journalists released a report detailing the firm's decades-long use of shell companies to suppress competition and bury small businesses. Insider trading accusations followed. Then the SEC opened a formal inquiry. It didn't matter how polished the PR statements were. It didn't matter that Ethan tried to do damage control with a tearful interview about family loyalty. The rot had always been there. My refusal had simply turned the lights on. Stock prices plummeted. Major funds pulled out. 2 board members resigned. Whitmore Capital's empire, the one they had built by silencing dissent and demanding submission, was bleeding in public. And I said nothing. I gave no interviews. I declined offers to share my truth on panels or podcasts. I didn't tweet. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post. I simply kept building. In a modest co-working space on the other side of Boston, I sat across from 2 brilliant engineers and a UX strategist I'd recruited quietly over the past year. Together, we were developing a supply chain platform that prioritized transparency, ethics, and scalability. The irony didn't escape me. We were building the very thing Whitmore once tried to acquire and bury. My apartment, bought in my name, with my money, felt warmer than it ever had. My grandmother's voice on the phone, asking if I was eating enough and sleeping well, became my favorite part of the day. Some evenings, I would sit by the window with chamomile tea and no noise at all. No headlines, no battles, just quiet. I hadn't destroyed anyone. I hadn't set out to burn anything down. All I did was say no. No, I will not erase myself for your comfort. No, I will not walk into a gilded cage and pretend it's love. No, I will not stay silent to make you feel powerful. And that no, that single, unremarkable word, shattered a dynasty. Because the truth is, when a house is built on fear, the moment someone stops being afraid, it starts to fall. Ethan never called again. Not after the board removed his name from several positions. Not after the family foundation was audited. Not after Margaret stepped down. And I didn't expect him to. He had made his choice. So had I. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the girl building exit plans in the dark. I was the woman sitting in daylight, blueprint in hand, owning every nail and beam. If you've stayed with me from the beginning of this story, thank you. Tell me in the comments, did you feel what I felt? Would you have walked away like I did? Or stayed and fought a different war? Let me know what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. Real stories. About women who don't fold. About women who choose themselves. And if this one resonated with you, like it, share it, and subscribe to hear more voices like mine. Because sometimes the loudest thing a woman can do is walk out in silence.